Now, I don't know about you, but it's very easy to feel overwhelmed as we're bombarded by facts and figures and science and that never-ending news footage of the consequences of the climate crisis, to the point where we just simply tune out, or even worse, we begin to deny it. And this is all despite the fact that we're reasonable people who actually care about our planet. We want to see action taken and we want to play our part. But I think it's also fair to say that we just want to know what to expect so we can go ahead and plan and navigate our own and our family's futures without this kind of end of the world scenario fears hanging above our heads. Hey, I'm Greg, welcome back to the channel, and thanks for joining me for this episode of Gregg The Artivist. It's back to the climate this week as I continue on my journey to understand everything there is about the climate crisis in my climate story. And I'm breaking this episode down into a three-part series. It's my aim to provide us with a simple, science-based, no-nonsense explanation to empower us with the knowledge of the basic climate change facts that we need to know, what are the impacts that we can expect on our lives, and how can we mitigate and adapt to these changes. Now, sure, some of this information is a bit scary, but it's not all doom and gloom, particularly if we choose to start acting now. So in today's episode, let's first take a look at the facts that we need to know, where this information is coming from, and why we can trust it. So let's just jump straight into it. Now, to get started, let's step back to the basic science. But wait, for those of you whose eyes just rolled back in your head and you went to switch off after hearing the word science, let's take a quick look at a moment why we may not trust science how we used to. Well, since the discovery that advertising can influence consumers' behaviors, profit-driven companies have very loosely used science in their favor to convince us why we should buy their products. And over time, we have been given so many conflicting science-proven advices. For example, if we take a look at the food and supplement industry, we're being told we should eat more of this and we should take more of that, all promising to solve all sorts of human conditions. To then having the real research done following these fads, which have come out and said, well, hang on, too much of this or too much of that isn't good for you. And over the last 70 years, it's become more and more difficult to trust what advertisers are promoting to us. And journalism hasn't helped either, because on reporting on these fads, they've being topical, they get readership, they get viewership, and the journalists haven't taken a deeper look into the science with that journalist's critical eye that we rely on. So with all of that said, let's assume that the science we have here is good and accurate, and later I'll explain where that science came from and how we can trust it. And yes, I'm sure you have seen or heard this before, but to be concise in this series, I really encourage you to bear with me and watch this through. It's pretty important stuff, and even if we understand nothing more of the climate science, this is what we should be very clear on. So how does science know that there's actually something going on with our climate? Well, if we take a look at this graph here, we can see that it shows the carbon dioxide levels, or the CO2 levels, in our atmosphere over thousands of years. And we can see that for thousands of years, the CO2 levels have gone up and down pretty consistently, and that's a normal occurrence for our planet. But at the end here, we can see a huge spike in levels of CO2, which started since the Industrial Revolution. And in 1950, we began breaking CO2 records, and it has been increasing at a rapid rate ever since. Now, science research tells us that the cause of the CO2 level increase is due to human activity. And this is the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas to power and fuel industry and transportation and our homes, which is releasing carbon dioxide and nitrogen oxides, to the point where there's just a lot more of us. You know, the global population has tripled over the last 70 years, and our ever-growing appetite is consuming more animal products than ever, who are releasing methane. And carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and methane are all greenhouse gases. So what then is a greenhouse gas? Well, a greenhouse gas is a gas that accumulates in the Earth's atmosphere, and it absorbs and emits infrared radiation from the sun. And the main greenhouse gases that we're discussing here today are carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, methane, and somewhat surprising to me, water vapor. Now, carbon dioxide is produced naturally from animals, plants, and people, and it's released during respiration. Now, it's not as powerful as some of the others, but CO2 is set for the long run. It hangs around in our atmosphere anywhere between 300 to 1,000 years. And unnaturally, CO2 is also a waste product of combustion of fossil fuels in power stations. And then we have methane, which is produced naturally in the guts of animals, and it's released during fluctuation. Now, methane is 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. It does, however, have a shorter lifespan of approximately 12 years, but it has a super high energy absorption rate of trapping heat in the atmosphere. And unnaturally, methane is also a waste product of combustion of coal and power stations at transportation of coal. And nitrogen oxides is produced naturally when lightning strikes. Now, nitrogen oxide has a brief lifespan of just 5 to 10 days, yet it is 300 times more potent than CO2. And it is also a waste product of the combustion of coal at power stations and fuel combustion in our transportation, such as cars and planes. And then we have water vapor, which occurs naturally when water from our ocean, seas, rivers and lakes evaporates. And science has identified that the global water lifetime or water vapor lifetime is about 8 to 9 days from the present conditions in 2017. However, that is believed to be increasing. Now, water vapor is the dominant greenhouse gas in our atmosphere. However, it has these windows that allow some of the infrared energy to escape without it being absorbed. It also sits lower in our atmosphere, which means it's less effective at trapping radiation. Unnaturally, however, as the planet is heating well beyond these pre-industrial levels, much more water is evaporating and collecting in our atmosphere. And so we have all these greenhouse gases floating around in our atmosphere, and these are creating the greenhouse effect or contributing to the greenhouse effect. So what then is the greenhouse effect? So what then is the greenhouse effect? Well, this is when solar radiation travels from the sun to the Earth. Some of this is reflected by the Earth's atmosphere. However, the majority of it is absorbed by the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And the greenhouse gases then emit this radiation onto the Earth's surface. And this is how the Earth warms up. The Earth, however, reflects a small amount of that solar radiation back up to the atmosphere. And this is where the greenhouse gases again absorb this reflected radiation, and again they reflect it back to the Earth, which further warms up the Earth's surface. Now, a little of this is good. We know that we need some greenhouse gases to keep the Earth warm. And we saw that in the previous chart where we saw the fluctuation of the heating and cooling of the Earth up until the Industrial Revolution. However, as many more greenhouse gas emissions are being produced, they are trapping way too much solar radiation in the atmosphere, and this is increasing the Earth's temperature way too rapidly. And the greenhouse effects contribute to global warming. Now, global warming is the gradual increase in the overall temperature of the Earth's atmosphere, which is generally attributed to the greenhouse effect caused by the increased levels of carbon dioxide and other pollutants. And as global warming has become worse, we now have scientific evidence to see a change in global and regional climate patterns, in particular a change that is very apparent since the mid to late 20th century onwards, again attributed to these large levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide and other pollutants, and we now know this process as climate change. Now, climate change is considered the single biggest threat to humanity, and we saw that our language changed to reflect this in the late 2020s to climate crisis. More recently, however, with the deadline of 2030 to make the significant changes to human activity rapidly approaches, we've seen that the language is again just beginning to evolve from climate crisis to climate emergency. So, where is all this science coming from? Well, it's coming from the IPCC. But why are they important, and why should we listen to them? Now, I would like to start off by taking a quick look together at the IPCC's website to look for answers to these questions. Now it says, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so the IPCC, is a United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change. The IPCC provides regular assessments of the scientific basis of climate change, its impact and future risks and options for adaptation and mitigation. It was created in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Programme. And the objective of the IPCC is to provide all governments at all levels with scientific information that they can use to help develop climate policies, as well as their reports being key to input into international climate change negotiations. And the IPCC is an organization of governments that are members of the United Nations or the WMO, and the IPCC currently has 195 country members. Now, thousands of people from all over the world contribute to the work of the IPCC. For the assessment reports, experts volunteer their time as IPCC authors to assess the thousands of scientific papers published each year to provide a comprehensive summary of what is known about the drivers of the climate change, its impact and future risks, and how adaptation and mitigation can reduce those risks. And it's an open and transparent review by experts and governments around the world is an essential part of the IPCC's process to ensure an objective and complete assessment and to reflect a diverse range of views and expertise. And through its assessments, it can identify the strength of scientific agreement in different areas and indicate where further research is needed. And the IPCC does not conduct its own research. Now, if you'd like more information about the IPCC and the reports that they've written, I've put links in the description box below. And of course, this is where we got the information from for today's episode. Now, as a critical thinker, I am not about to believe every word written, particularly by any entity about themselves on their own website. And so it didn't take a lot of digging around to see that the IPCC has been heavily criticized in the past, particularly if we're looking back a decade or further ago. Now, there were many questions over their administration, their assessment process, and the level of experience by their so-called experts in their fields. And furthermore, there were questions about no matter how impressive their list of 100 nations was back then, there was only about 24 nations where they were in a position to nurture first-class educational and research facilities. And I'm smiling as I say this because just hearing myself say those words thinks of scientific snobbery, elitism of the West, and exclusive behaviors. But nevertheless, it's equally important to note that this was also a time when the scientific community were completely divided about the climate science itself. So, however, in the last decade, with reform of the IPCC in its process, but probably more important, the significant advances in climate technology and climate understanding, coupled with almost complete unity of the scientific world, it's transformed the good intentions of the IPCC of the past into this credible and influential body that we see today. Now, what I find particularly reassuring when I was looking up sort of into them and to find out more information is, okay, we know that their reports are scientific in nature with the purpose to inform international political negotiations about the climate crisis. But that did beg the question, as governments are the key stakeholders, what is the role that the governments are playing in this report's production? And I was really happy to find out that although governments can propose authors and contributors, they can participate in reviews and they can help reach a consensus on the report's major findings, governments are not permitted to edit the report. And any influence of the wording by governments, maybe it's to support their own position, is correctly overruled by the other governments present and the climate experts to ensure that the language does not veer away from the evidence. Now, due to government's involvement, the other great thing is that they just can't go around and dismiss this report. After all, it is they themselves who have helped shape and approve the report. And this is essentially holding them accountable to the scientific facts and the action that's needed. And most importantly, despite governments having representation and involvement, be it financial or otherwise, it all comes down to the scientists who write the chapters. It is the scientists who are in control, and therefore they ensure the consistency with findings and scientific credibility. So to understand this physical science of the climate change that we've just discussed, in part I've used the Summary for Policymaker headliner statements from the IPCC report. Now this report, as we've mentioned, isn't written for the general public. It is written to inform governments and policy changes, which I feel is a real shame, as it'd be hugely useful to have this kind of one-stop shop of this information accessible at all levels of the community. And some of the language could be much simpler. But I'd like to run through these headlines in support of what we've presented so far, just to be concise for the series. And I've added a link in the description box below where you can download the PDF of this report from the IPCC. The current state of the climate. It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere and biosphere have occurred. Now, simply put, along the thousands of contributors, of scientists and our governments, they've all agreed that human activity has already and is causing global warming and changes to our planet's climate. The scale of recent changes across the climate system as a whole and the present state of many aspects of the climate system are unprecedented over many centuries to thousands of years. Well, this is just to say that the science has looked through the history, like the chart that we looked at earlier, and we know that throughout time the planet has warmed and cooled naturally. However, science has now proven that the current changes to climate exceed that in the speed of these changes occurring naturally beyond anything that we've seen over thousands of years. Human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. Evidence of observed changes in extremes such as heat waves, heavy precipitation, droughts and tropical cyclones, and in particular their attribution to human influence, has strengthened since AR5. Now, in the most part, this is probably, pretty self-explanatory, but it's referencing to AR5, which is referring to the IPCC report from 2013. So in other words, since the scientific studies of that report, the human-induced climate change has worsened. Improved knowledge of the climate processes, paleoclimate evidence and response to the climate system to increasing radioactive forcing, giving a best estimate of equilibrium climate sensitivity of 3 degrees Celsius with a narrow range compared to AR5. So this is basically saying that the physical science has improved along with our learning, and we're able to narrow down the equilibrium climate sensitivity since the last report. Now, the equilibrium is the Earth's temperature with double CO2 before devastating irreversible impacts, which was previously set at 4.5 degrees in their previous report. Now, possible climate futures. Global surfaces will continue to increase until at least the mid-century under all emission scenarios considered. Global warming of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees Celsius will be exceeded during the 21st century unless deep reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. Well, again, I think that this one is actually quite self-explanatory, although I'm very interested in the use of the words deep reductions. I find this a very vague use of the word. We're actually saying we need to make significant changes. Many changes in the climate system become larger in direct relation to increasing global warming. They include increases in the frequency and intensity of hot extremes, marine heat waves, heavy precipitation, and in some regions, agricultural and ecological droughts, and an increase in the proportion of intense tropical cyclones and reductions in Arctic sea ice, snow-covered and permafrost. I think all of that's quite self-explanatory. The continued global warming is projected to further intensify the global water cycle, including its variable global monsoon participation and the severity of wet and dry events. Again, I think that that's actually quite self-explanatory in itself. Under scenarios with increasing CO2 emissions, the ocean and land carbon sinks are projected to be less effective, slowing accumulation of the CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, our oceans and forests are huge lungs taking in carbon, and already we're seeing our seas struggle and acidify with bleaching off and killing reefs. And our forests, well, we're knocking them down at a rapid rate, so there's not much to say about them. Many changes due to the past and future greenhouse gas emissions are irreversible for centuries to millennia, especially changes in the ocean, ice sheets and global sea level. I think this is probably like the boldest statement and maybe the most frightening statement. This unequivocally states that there is no recourse to amend the rising level of the sea level, and the impact of this is, immediately puts billions of people living on coastal areas and islands at a significant risk. The average high school student doesn't doubt, that climate changes exist, but they do not take associated risks personally.
I agree. I absolutely agree. People are really worried about polar bears, for example, about the rainforest. And what people don't realize, it's a strange thing, I never realized it myself, but they never look at their own environment. They think we're safe here. In fact, I think a couple of years ago, there was this whole reportage or report about journalists asking climate scientists in the Netherlands about the effects in the Netherlands, and the effects are very worrying. Even if the sea level only changes like only a meter, by the way. At one point, we Dutch people have to move. There is no other way around it. And the other conclusion of this whole series was the Dutch think that is nonsense. We think we can build dikes and we're going to be fine. That's not the case. We're not going to be fine. So we have to move into Germany. And so we can be happy that we're friends with the Germans. Yeah, but tying back to what we talked about before, but imagine you live in Bangladesh and you have to move. You have to move into India, and India and Bangladesh haven't been proven to be the best friends, to put it mildly. So yes, I do really tie into developing regions being more affected and leading up to war and other civil unrest and stuff like that. But to answer your first question again, no, I don't think they're aware that we are also going to suffer. Although way less than developing countries, yeah. Also, I don't think people really realize that if Greenland melts, and it is melting at the moment, that is sea level rise already 6 or 7 meters, only based on the melting water. We're not even talking about the expansion of the ocean water, which is usually double. And now we're not even talking about Antarctica, which is probably in the 50 to 70 meters. Okay, granted, that's going to take hundreds of years before it all melts, but we're not talking about a few centimeters or even a few meters, what people say. It's massive. yeah.
Okay, since starting this channel, there is one thing that I can say is crystal clear to me, and that is we react very differently when we hear or just see the word climate crisis. And I say this with all confidence because in each and every video I've made in the series to date, I see a huge decline or drop off in my audience at the very second that I first mention climate crisis or the word appears in the titles. And seriously, I mean the very second, not a second sooner or later. It's like bang, right on the mark. But why is this? Well, I think the climate crisis stirs up all sorts of thoughts, emotions and responses, from anger to guilt to action to denial. For many of us, it's just simply too big. It's too far away from directly impacting us right now. It's too overwhelming, or dare I even say it's too inconvenient. And of course, what is presented to us for the most part, it's all kind of doom and gloom. But does this actually need to be, the way? The simple answer is absolutely not. Yes, we see today that it's a fact. Human activity is speeding up the process of global warming, and it is already having a devastating impact. But the harsh reality is this is just the beginning, particularly if we don't make those significant changes now. And yes, we are slowly beginning to realize just how significant those changes are going to have to be. And a great example of this is a very topical subject matter here in the Netherlands these last few years, as we have been seeing huge protests and demonstrations by our farmers. Now, this is because the Dutch government has new policies that aim to halve the nitrogen oxide and ammonia pollution in the country by 2030. But the consequences of these agricultural reforms will likely make many farmers have to drastically reduce their number of livestock or get rid of them altogether. And according to government estimates, this could lead to the closure of about 30% of livestock farms in the Netherlands. And that is just to reduce emissions of these by 50% by 2030. So these changes very well deserve the title of being significant. So of course, this has had people all across the country up in arms, and even farmers from around the world who have seen this as a possible precedent of what they can expect their government to do to them are getting involved in the conversation. And these reforms have a real threat to the farmers' current livelihoods, from bank foreclosures on farms to people being displaced from work to an impact on the overall economy. But if we in the Netherlands think that this is bad, this is just one of the many industries the government here has previously been financially supporting to encourage economic growth through these practices of emissions and damaging pollutants. And the Netherlands, despite its tiny size, is the second largest exporter of agricultural produce in the world after the United States. But just to put its size into perspective, the landmass of the Netherlands is just a tiny 41,500 square kilometers. You could fit the Netherlands into the United States a whopping 237 times. And despite, the beautiful canals, the windmills, the rows of tulips, and the sandy beaches that we project to the world, the Netherlands is actually one of the heaviest polluting countries in Europe. If the wind was to stop blowing here, we would be in grave danger. And this hasn't gone unnoticed by other countries and the EU, especially with our neighbours. The pollution, is slipping from our agricultural waste, and it's spreading into the land and rivers of Germany and Belgium, whom are rightly demanding higher reforms from the Dutch. Yet this is just one sector, and what about the consequences of these sort of polluting behaviours? The Netherlands, of course, is famous for its water management and reclaiming of land. After all, 26% of the country is below sea level, and 17% of the country is reclaimed from sea and lakes. More interesting for me is that 60% of the soils here is actually man-made, and it really means that every inch of land here is planned, it's manicured, it's micromanaged, and it's required to be so to effectively balance its economy from being one of the richest countries in the world to having space for agriculture and for industry and housing its ever-growing population of 17.5 million people. And should, the sea levels continue to increase at their current rates, even at those bottom end scales, up to 50% of the country could be reclaimed by the sea, with the potential of causing mass migration into neighbouring countries. And of course, we are seeing similar threats across the world. So with all this threat that we face, how is it possible to really understand and take on board what's happening with the climate crisis to be responsible, yet still be able to live happy, fulfilling, and optimistic lives? Well, that's certainly a question for psychology, and one I'm going to come back to, but a great place to start is simply to understand what are the facts, what are the threats, what are the solutions, and what can we expect our lives to look like, over the coming 7.5 years to 2030 and beyond. I know that as an artist, I would feel powerless to comment or act in, say, the job of a doctor. But if I was trained to be a doctor, would I still feel so powerless? Well, no, because with knowledge comes power. And when we are empowered, we have less fear of the unknown, and we are more likely to take stock of our futures, and most importantly, we're more likely to take the action required. Now, that does wrap up things for today's episode, but please remember to join me for part 2 of this special series as we look at what are the impacts from the confirmed climate crisis causes that we've discussed today. And in between, of course, we will have an episode focusing back on the art as I build my huge cardboard sculpture in response to the climate crisis and as a call for climate action now. And as always, if you haven't done so already and you enjoyed today's episode, then please be sure to give this video a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel and click on that bell to be updated of future episodes. I cannot express enough how these simple actions go a long way in helping the YouTube algorithm recognize that I exist on their platform and help to put my content in front of other like-minded people. And if you'd like more information about today's episode, then you might consider joining me over at Patreon. There are a ton of benefits to become a member of the Gregg The Artivist community, and you can read about all the different levels of membership and the benefits that each level has to offer from the link in the description box below. And finally, do also consider following me over on Instagram, where you'll be able to see exactly what I'm getting up to in between each of these episodes. With that said, until next time, please take care and remember that you too do have a voice.